Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session on diversity and equity in our industry. My name is LaAsia Hundley, and I'm going to serve as the moderator of this amazing panel that we have put together to talk about diversity and equity in our industry. So I'll start very briefly, and I'm sure you may have read their bios, but we have a dynamic panel scheduled for today to have some transparent, open, experience-based conversation on diversity and inclusion in our industry. So I'll start with Gina Callender. Gina, who has spent over 20 years with Edison, is currently a director in strategic planning, where her responsibilities include managing the Edison Gas Long Range Plan, Orange and Rockland's Electric and Gas Long Range Plan, our Steam Long Range Plan, along with studies that explore electrification and define pathways to obtain net zero carbon greenhouse gas emissions. Gina has had a number of responsibilities within Edison, and in addition to that, has served as a mentor in so many capacities. So I am certain as she begins to share her experiences, we're all going to learn a great deal from Gina. Good morning, Gina.
Good morning, everyone.
Next, I'll move to Natalie Edwards. Natalie is the Chief Diversity Officer at National Grid, the multinational electricity and gas utility company headquartered in London, England, that's focused on transforming electricity and natural gas networks with smarter, cleaner, and more resilient energy solutions. Prior to joining National Grid, Natalie served as the Global Executive Director of Inclusion and Diversity for Estee Lauder Companies, where she led their inclusion strategy and operations for over 45,000 employees. Now, if Natalie was driving strategy for 45,000 employees, I am certain she has some gems that she's going to share this morning. Natalie, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Happy to be here. I'm hearing a little bit of static, so hoping everyone can hear me okay.
Okay, we'll check the audio. Let me move on and next introduce Tohma Gadson-Shaw. Tohma, who currently works for Edison as a department manager in human resources and labor and wage. However, in October of 2020, Tohma was selected as a full-time CEO Action for Racial Equity Fellow, which is led by PricewaterhouseCoopers. The CEO Action for Racial Equity provides all CEO Action signatories and fellows the opportunity to work together to identify, develop, and promote scalable and sustainable policies and corporate best practices to address systemic racism and social injustice while improving societal well-being in the areas of healthcare, public safety, economic development, and education. Given this opportunity, Tohma has had the ability to merge her passions as she believes in a great responsibility to drive social change and being able to influence corporate policies. Good morning, Tohma, and welcome to the panel.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And last but certainly not least, Nancy Harvey, who is our Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the New York Power Authority, to many of us known as NYPA, the nation's largest state power organization. Nancy is responsible for providing leadership and strategic direction in creating and supporting an environment that is inclusive, respectful, and strives to be free from discrimination, intolerance, harassment, and retaliation. Natalie recently oversaw the development and implementation of NYPA's 10-point DEI plan and led an audit of their DEI program. And we are so excited to have you with us, Nancy, and I'm sure that you will be sharing a great deal with us in the audience. So welcome and good morning.
Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here.
Awesome. And I just wanted to do a quick check because I wanted to make sure that everyone is hearing everyone and we're all good to go, because the information that's going to be shared this morning is something that we don't want anyone to miss out on. So I'm going to start with some questions for the panel. There will also be opportunities for those of our audience members to pose questions that will blend in as well. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started, as this is a panel that I am excited and have to remember to moderate and not just sit and listen to the gems that this audience is going to share. So I'm going to start first with a question around how are diversity initiatives progressing now as compared to 2020 and to the years before that? Have things slowed down? Have things sped up? So I'm going to start with Natalie on that question. Natalie, can you provide some insight there?
Oh man, starting with me. Um, LaAsia, it's lovely, like I said, to be here. I think about this question a lot, not only as a chief diversity officer, but also as a Black woman. I think many people forget that they're chief diversity officers, especially if they themselves from an underrepresented group, are also experiencing many of the problems that it's our jobs to solve for others. And I'm so glad you started with that, because I think that if I could say it 20 times, it's, executives are not robots. We're also humans. And the few Black leaders, unfortunately, in our industry are human beings dealing with that experience every day. And there's no level in organization that you reach and all of a sudden you don't feel bias, right? Or you don't have any of those issues. So I want to start with that, because when I think about have DEI efforts slowed down, I think that's a question we have to focus on. And by the way, it cannot just be people who lead DEI that are asking that question. If it's one thing I've learned in this work, is if I'm the most passionate person about diversity at the organization, change is not going to happen, right? So it's really important that we audit ourselves and really challenge ourselves as leaders to ask ourselves, is our foot still on the gas pedal, right? Or are we giving ourselves almost a false sense of achievement because we focused on social justice in 2020, or in 2021, and now it's 2022. And I think a lot of our organizations have to ask the hard question: were we really committed, or were we committed in 2020? Are we really committed, or were we committed when we needed to be? Were we really committed, or were we committed for a season, right? And so I think what we're seeing, and many of us on this panel today, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but we are really driving the conversation and holding our peers accountable and our industry accountable to make sure that if you can't tell me what you're doing about racial justice today, then maybe you weren't committed, right? So we're really going to see the rubber hitting the road. And I feel like, the saying, and I'm paraphrasing, but the road less traveled, or the further you go, the less crowded the road to success gets. DEI is the same way. The further we're going to get away from 2020 is where we're going to see who was really committed and who was in it when the conversation wasn't as viral as it was in the heat of 2020. And I think that is something that I think about daily. It is something that I'm personally committed to, that DEI, and specifically race, is not a trend. And it's not a crisis that we needed to figure out at the time. It's something we need to be long-term committed to. And we need to be keeping the same amount of energy, pun intended, to this work in 2022, 2025, 2030, as we did in the summer of 2020.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And there was something you said there around the road less traveled, but also keeping our foot on the pedal. So certainly sounds like you agree. We started on a path in 2020, but we need to continue. I wanted to go to Gina to see if she had anything to add there.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say definitely, at least at Con Edison, the pedals to the metal. I think there was that renewed sense of, or maybe I want to say it was awokeness in 2020 on a corporate level versus individuals. And we introduced a concept called having courageous conversations. So to your point, Natalie, right, you just can't do the work in one space. It's not just the Office of ODI, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. It's actually spread and cascaded throughout the organization. So we set up something called diversity councils. We have diversity councils across the enterprise in all departments, and then they meet on a monthly basis to discuss things. And then we have our departmental diversity councils, which then kind of start to cascade it through the department, right? And I'm seeing more and more engagement, more and more excitement, more and more need for connection as time goes on. So it started in 2020. I think in 2021, we got that renewed sense, especially if we think about intersection and we think about anti-Asian hate, right? And so it's like everything is just cumulative, right? And so I think we're well on the path to continue this forward, and I don't see it letting up at all.
Thank you, Gina, for that and kind of sharing. And I appreciate that intersection that you inject. I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about that on some other questions. Nancy, I wanted to ask your opinion on that with regards to compared to 2020 and the years before that. Have things slowed down? Have they sped up? And do you have anything that you like to share?
Sure. I agree with everything that Natalie and Gina just shared. Look, we're looking for sustainable commitment, right? It's not just you're emotional and we're all feeling, amped and motivated, right? That's what happened in 2019, 2020. The goal is always to make sure that people understand that this is an ongoing journey, and we can't solve the bias and inequities in society with just word of mouth and good intentions. We actually have to start to activate and really act on what we're doing. At NYPA, we started with our multicultural ERG, right? We listened to everyone, and then we decided that we're committed to accelerating DEI. And that was beautiful. And it was great to see leaders and business unit heads, the trustees, everybody started coming together, right, Natalie? Like everybody's decided that DEI is not just HR or my office. It's everybody's concern. It's everybody's goal. And it's now embedded as a foundational pillar in our Vision 2030 strategy. That's one thing. We've actually done a few more initiatives around mitigating bias and all those other things. But the one thing I want to say is for Vision 2030 is accountability and transparency, right? So we did the audit to check our progress and to see how our program stood up. And then we had to identify metrics. How are we going to track progress? What are we going to do? And we have to report into the trustees and the governance committee. I think that's a big part of keeping the momentum going. We had we have an interim CEO and president now, right? So that was like, wow, this is testing just how committed we are. And I'm happy to say the interim president, Justin Driscoll, the trustees, nothing's changed, right? We've continued to drive DEI at NYPA. I'm pleased with that. It's a long journey. So I want to make sure that we're being driven and honest and listening to our employees and looking at the metrics, the hard conversations around how we're doing, and developing strategies as we go along and initiatives in the coming years, because representation is not good. And going especially looking upwards through the ranks, we want to see that grow. So this is a very good question, and it's something that we have to keep in mind always.
Thank you for that, Nancy. And I wrote a note as you were talking, that sustainable commitment. We talk about sustainability as an industry, right? But when we talk about DE&I, it's that same lens, sustainable, and what you mentioned, not just for those of us who are working in the industry now, but for those of us who are going to continue to come into this great industry. So thank you for that tidbit. And I'm going to shift over to Tohma and pose the same question. And I found it interesting in your bio because in October of 2020, as we talk about if things have shifted from 2020, is when you joined and became a fellow with the CEO Action. So if you can share, what do you think compared to 2020 or years before that? Are diversity initiatives progressing? What are you hearing? And I think you're in a unique position with so many different industries crossing. So I wanted to ask the same question of you.
Thank you. I would like to thank AABE-NYMAC for hosting this and LaAsia, you for moderating this panel. But listening to my esteemed fellow panelists just got me really excited. So I am so happy and delighted to be here. Let me start by saying that race has been a vital part of the nation's conversation over the last 2 years. So how could we not be a part of that conversation? After the murder of George Floyd at a time where camera phones exposed such a traumatic event, when we could not ignore it because we all were home quarantining, corporate America stood up at that time. It was very encouraging to see corporations take early steps toward addressing racial injustice post the murder, and the cascade of statements of support for Black lives poured out from Fortune 500 corporations which was necessary. It was a necessary progress. While in years prior, similar statements have been made by corporations in solidarity of events where Black people were murdered, unarmed, and it fell off of the nation's radar as soon as it fell off of our television screens. Then everyone reverted back to their normal way of living. Those earlier statements were just bridges back to familiar, comfortable, and non-threatening status quo. The difference, I think, in the initiatives after 2020, May of 2020, I would submit, had a lot to do with the public demanding moral and economic leadership within the corporate sector that focused on the next generation. They are serious about demanding a more equitable legacy than ever before, and this generation is advocating for transparency and action. So that's what we've been seeing corporations respond to. In an effort to live up to our humanity at Con Edison, we had the unique opportunity, as LaAsia stated, to participate in CEO Action for Racial Equity. It's the first business-led coalition of its kind to address systemic racism and advance public policy, and also improve societal well-being. I was selected to step away. It's a full-time fellowship, and we look at local, state, and federal level laws on a full-time basis in concert with representatives from 100 different companies. And we're mobilizing around these very important topics. And they're 4 focused areas, but they're not the only focused areas. So like when you ask, have things slowed down, I would say that they are at different speeds depending on the goals and priorities of the companies that initiated them. And we need to ensure that we are all helping to continue the progress. We do that by ensuring access, speaking up when we don't see it. We have to build relationships, and we have to push to create some pipelines. And I think it was Nancy that stated that we want to see more people that look like us in all levels of our corporations. Companies and corporations need to be transparent about their statistics. A lot of them are not, and still are not. And they need to mean what they say when they make these pledges to assist this community. And they need to bring receipts on how they align to their values and equity. Let's not normalize the lack of progress because people are more comfortable. Like, things can only slow down if we get quiet. So I say that we just continue to push this message with our voices, and it will continue to move on.
Thank you for that, Tohma. And it's interesting. I'm going to come back to you with a follow-up question, but timing, right? And where we are and the voices that we have. And you said something around, it's a necessary moment. It's necessary change that has to happen. And to hear just a little bit about what the corporations are doing. But there was something that you just talked about. And then listening from whether it's the CEO in Actions, Con Edison, NYPA, NatGrid, there was a theme in all of the responses that you ladies gave with regards to accountability, sustainability, and our role in making sure that this doesn't come off the radar. You said something where we're all watching, not just us, but we want to see if what we're talking about, the visions we set forth, actually materialize. So I wanted to ask a question with regards, and I'll start with you, Tohma. Are there companies that you've seen or that you've learned through the CEO in Action in the sense of, are they making really good progress in this regard and can be held up almost as models or examples? We do a lot of benchmarking in our industry, right, on a number of topics. So are there things that companies are doing, models that are there that we can emulate? And if so, can you give an example or two? And then Natalie, I'm going to come to you as well with the question just to hear your insights. So Tohma, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I think the most important thing that we can do is to be sincere about the opportunities and things that we engage in. Inside the company, we need to be doing it within our communities, where the companies are, where they're headquartered or where they conduct business, and at the broader societal level. I don't think that it's one or the other. I believe that it's all three. And I believe that PricewaterhouseCoopers, which we call PwC, is doing that. Tim Ryan, he's the US chair and senior partner of the company, and he is courageous and transformative in this space. In 2016, he co-founded CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, and it launched along with 112 initial sign-on companies that sign on to commitments to do D&I work and share best practices within their company. And Con Edison was one of the first companies that signed on, not knowing what to expect, but understanding that we need to move in this space. And now there are over 2,000 companies committed to coming together to share best practices in that space. The additional killings of unarmed Black people is what caused PwC to realize that they needed to do more in this space. And they needed to do things differently with scale. Nancy just mentioned that as well. We want to be sustainable, which is why CEO Action for Racial Equity was birthed. The fellowship was one, however, of 6 commitments from PwC. It's a big undertaking to me. I'm in the fellowship, but it was one of their 6 commitments. They have 5 others. They formed a D&I staff advisory council. They donated to social justice organizations. They started to be transparent about their diversity plans and the firm's progress as time goes on. But one thing I thought was so cool that they did in their 6-point plan, they provide a full week of paid time off for all of their 55,000 plus employees to serve on nonprofit organizations of their choice every year. So they pay them to take time off to serve in these capacities and they also encourage their global offices to engage in local grassroots and grass tops organizations. Those are just their 6 priorities. They are doing a lot in the space. And I would say, like, when I talk about inside the company, more than 80%, like closer to 90% of Black Americans say that it's very important for companies to pay for living wages and commit to diverse hiring, apprenticeships, and diverse pipelines. So we are pushing for that. And within the community, historically, practices and policies are deeply embedded in the way cities and neighborhoods and communities are organized. Your social determinants of health have a lot to do with where you live and your zip code. So your life expectancy, companies should be concerned about that because that ties into a lot of the services or benefits that companies provide, and it can save them money if you don't have people truly affected by social determinants of health because of where they live. And companies should take a closer look at their philanthropic efforts, their support on environmental justice. AABE, the national website of AABE, they have a set of principles on their site that talks about what utility industries should do, like guidelines that they should use and how to engage the community. And I think that's extremely important as well. So everyone should go and take a look at those principles. Lastly, when you talk about like the societal level, we are seeing a legacy of federally supported policies like Redlining and Homestead Act and GI Bill that continue to affect the lives of Black Americans. And we're seeing things like voting rights now. So these are not things of the past. There are current policies that are being introduced or pre-filed. There are about 350 bills, maybe much more, since the beginning of 2020 that was filed to suppress voting rights. Yet we don't see many corporations speaking out against that. So communicating your support for or your speaking against some of these things that affect your employees and your customers who are, people of color is something that I think that companies should definitely do. And some companies are doing it and other companies are silent. So I can go on and on. So I'll pass it to Natalie.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Yes, and just kind of continuing, whether there are things that you and your company are doing, or if you think there are other companies that really are serving as models. So if you can chime in, that would be great.
Yeah, well, first of all, I applaud Tohma for, she laid out a ton of stuff that I think we all need to underscore. But to answer the question, if I have something to add, I just wanted to say that, often we look at, best place to work lists or most inclusive company lists, and our industry is no exception, right? And I know that every time one of our organizations are awarded, it is well-deserved. And there are people, really very real people behind those awards who work tirelessly to drive that change. However, what I'm concerned about sometimes is that, and this is a truth that you learn when you're actually doing this work, right, is that no company is perfect. And it is very possible for an organization and a utility to be known as inclusive because of one area of investment and have so many other things to work on. And so, in many other cases, some of those other things are like really bad, right? Like, there are utilities that are very well known for their investment in supplier diversity. But when you talk to the employees of that utility that look like us, right? There are those of us that, like National Grid, we're really doubling down, and that's our just brand across the organization, not even just in diversity conversations, just in general. We really want to lead on climate change, right? And of course, there's an environmental justice element to that. There is a, community effort to that. There is a socioeconomic inequality, what area of town people get to live in, the energy available to them. There's so many DEI considerations in that, which we can talk about all day, right? But then, are we doing enough over here? So my point is that often people don't realize how complex diversity is in an organization. It's not just one thing. It's not just how the utility shows up at the career fair, right? It's so many other things that impact and can show how committed a company is to DEI. And again, I don't want to take away from any of the utilities, because all of us are trying to do our best in different areas, and that's okay. But that doesn't mean because we got number one on this list, we've achieved diversity and inclusion. And I think that we need to be real about that. And I always say that DEI is something we have to keep working on, because as soon as we get really good over here, are we paying attention over here? And I will just end with this. I think the one thing all utilities I've seen struggle with, that we need to have conversations about, that none of us have figured out. Let me be very transparent, even though we're doing our best, which is why organizations like AABE are so important and conversations like this are so important, is representation, right? We do not have, in my honest opinion, enough Black leaders in the energy space, in the utility space. I think that is due to a slew of reasons. And I think we need to continue, as someone so eloquently said earlier, using our voices, because we can't slow down if we keep talking. So I think it's important that, yes, we're externally engaged, and yes, we're CEO action, and yes, we're in our communities and environmental justice, and, working with Black colleges, of whom I am actually a proud alum of. I'm a very big advocate of Black colleges. All of those, okay. But after all of that, which is so important, what else is not moving? And I think we need to get, in my opinion, as equally serious about DEI in campus recruiting, in executive recruiting as we are in campus recruiting. Mm-hmm. We need to get as equally serious about current employee experience as we are about customer experience. At things like COP26, did we optimize as utilities and energy industry the racial diversity of the people who got to participate? All of these things, and I'm not trying to be necessarily negative. I'm just saying, I'm illustrating that there's always an opportunity to circle back and say, did we do all we could with DEI? And I think it's well and good and completely a good thing for us to celebrate when we do get that award, or we're on this list or that list. But that doesn't relieve us, especially those of us who are outside the DEI team, from still doing the work. And I think we have to be equally, if not more, committed to the work that is not rewarded on a list than we are about the things that get publicly rewarded.
Thank you for that, Natalie. And you see a lot of head nods amongst all of us who are listening. And as everyone was talking, there were a few things that stood out around how comprehensive a strategy to DEI needs to be, but it's equally as complex. But another thing that we talked about there was just the idea of our ability to continue to communicate, to keep the conversations going, and the responsibility that we have within our own companies to be part of that conversation. So thank you so much for that. I want to just shift a small bit, and we started to talk about it, both Natalie and Tohma mentioned it, but Nancy, I'm going to come to you first with this question regarding what are some ways that corporate America can contribute to the discussion outside of the walls of our own employers, outside of NYPA, outside of National Grid, outside of Edison? What are some of the ways that corporate America can contribute, and maybe one might say should be contributing to the discussion with regards to diversity and inclusion in our industry?
So it seems like we're attracting, right? We want people representation. We want folks to come internally and work with us. They're coming from our communities, right? They're coming from across society. And so it's important to engage with the communities where our facilities are located. Our environmental justice unit focuses their efforts in the communities where we are neighbors and underserved kids. If we're talking about providing services, it seems like building bridges and relationships with the communities is an opportunity. It's our obligation, but it's an opportunity to hear from them. What do they need? As opposed to us just saying, well, this is where we are. We show up, we have it, deal with it, right? It's a very relevant part of the conversation. And inclusivity comes into question, because you just, by doing that without checking on perspectives, especially people with that are our neighbors, you're excluding folks without even considering that they may require something special, something different. I do think for companies like ours, for instance, there is the opportunity. So STEM has low representation. And I've been in the energy industry for about 6 years now, and it's still the same. Like 30 to 50% of our employees are going to retire, and there's a huge opportunity, blah, blah, blah. But we do need to understand that feeding the pipeline, going out into the community and talking about what are the opportunities in our space, in our energy industry, whether it's to get equitable share of efficient energy efficiency products and benefiting from those initiatives, to encouraging folks to take a look at trades, right? Take a look at a journey person position, because that might be a good way to earn a good way to economically benefit your family. And it's a good entry point, and say, look, come in, be a journey person, and come into our company, and we will provide professional development, right? There are pathways to get even more advanced, and feed into other areas where we want to see representation. I think that encouraging our leaders and our employees also to learn about the communities that they're in, and practice and model it in their everyday life, so they understand people's perspectives, they understand the issues that come up for us, especially. And they're able to, when we attract talent, you're able to model some kind of inclusivity. You can understand if somebody tells you, I'm affected by the murder of George Floyd, I can't think, I need space today, right? Or I'm just not going to show up. And understand things like that, and how it can affect your performance, your ability to just concentrate for the week, because it's an ongoing issue for us. And then encourage staff to do that. Like at NYPA, we have a paid volunteer time, and you can take 2 to 3 days to go to a not-for-profit or a community event or anything of that type that you want to participate in, and it encourages broadening and learning more about what your community is going through and helping others, right? And it's a service mindset, but it's also a growth mindset in understanding what your neighbor might be experiencing and what your neighbor might need. So I think those are some of the ways, yeah.
Thank you for that. And a lot of it, I think, as you were talking, was anchoring in this sense of community, what's happening in our communities, the communities that we serve. Natalie, anything to add to that? So that, I think, is one tenet of what corporate America could be doing. You have anything else, or in addition to that?
Oh, always. Be careful what you ask for. But in all seriousness, I think everything that was just said, I agree with 100%. And I think sometimes when we think about how do we engage outside of the community, we think about like company-wide community programs, or again, paid volunteer time off, which I think is great. And I think more utilities need to do that. What I also push for as a chief diversity officer is not overly individualizing community engagement. Oh, we encourage everyone to go volunteer. What are we doing as an institution in these communities, right? Because you can have a lot of people volunteering and still be, and my point is, and I'll just tell this quick story. I joined National Grid in 2021. So in 2020, I was at Estee Lauder Companies, and many of our grandparents or past parents, many generations, we grew up hearing from those people, something along the lines of, show me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are, right? As a company, for me, it's tell me who you do business with and I'll tell you who you are, right? So we focus on employees, go volunteer, but actually, who are we doing business with, right? And an element of that is supplier diversity, of course, but I would also just say that it's equally important to look to our left and look to our right and say, what are the rooms we're in? And what are those people in the rooms doing, even if they don't work with us, or if they don't work for us, doesn't mean they're not working with us, right? And we need to be keeping that energy too. And in 2020, again, I was at Estee Lauder Companies, and for anybody who's bought products from MAC and Clinique and Aveda and Estee Lauder and Tom Ford and all these, the company owns 25 brands. And, that meant that if we were committed to DEI, we also needed to have a conversation, right, with the Macy's of the world, the Sephora's of the world, the Boots in the UK, all these major retailers around the world about what are you doing about DEI, right? Because when you look at a Sephora or an Ulta, a big percentage of the brands in there were under our umbrella. So if we believe in something, that means if we're doing business with you, I need to know what you're doing, right? And so without spilling any details, my point is that as utilities, it's not just what we do, it's about who we're around, it's about who we're doing business with. Show me who your friends are, I'll tell you who you are. So, and that's something that really inspires me. And so even going beyond things like community engagement and customer relations and all these things, we also need to remind ourselves, and big props to our US President Bader Khan, who really challenged me when I got to National Grid, talk about allyship, about thinking about this in this way, DEI in this way, is, I believe his words to me were, we're not a fish in a small pond. We're a big company and we have influence. How are we influencing the people we do business with to lead diversity as well? It's not enough for it to be important to us, because if it was really important to us, everyone we come into contact with, we would be talking about it with them and holding them accountable too. And I think about that often, right, from the Estee example, but also now. And one of the things we're proud to say, and this might be the first time saying it, you guys first to know, but in 2022, we are fully moving forward with having what we're calling an Energy and Equity Summit, where we're going to be inviting industry executives from many of these organizations on this panel locally to come together and say, here are the issues in our communities. How are we going to come together? A rising tide lifts all boats, right? So together we are stronger as utilities. How are we going to join forces and do better in our communities? Not only serve our communities, but improve our communities with the influence we have together side by side. And so those are the conversations that National Grid wants to have, because we're figuring it out. I believe everyone here is trying to figure it out, and together we can figure it out even better and even stronger. So that's the thing I will add, because I think it's important for anyone listening to volunteer. I think it's important for us to, as organizations, think about our communities. But I just wanted to add that point about show me who you do business with and I'll show you who you are. And we talk often about supplier diversity. Let's focus on women and minority-owned businesses. Yes, and let's increase that. I'm all for it. But the businesses that we do business with that are not women-owned and are not minority-owned, that don't mean they're off the hook. If you are employing lots of people under you and we do a lot of business with you, again, I'll ask you the Sephora question. What are you doing? Because if it's important to us and you're a big supplier of us, that means if it's truly important to us, we would be having that conversation. So really thinking bigger to see who we're doing business with and why.
This is the beauty of this panel and this conversation, right? Kind of step changing and pushing ourselves and pushing our companies. That I'm sure many of us in the audience probably heard our moms or our grandparents' voice when you said, what's your friend circle look like? It's a very practical way to then step into the walls of corporate America and say, who are we doing business with, and are we truly using our influence power? So Nancy and Natalie, thank you for that. Gina, I wanted to chime in with you as well to see and to hear your insights with regards to what ways corporate America can contribute to the discussion outside of the walls or in the walls, if you had anything else to add there.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think both Nancy and Natalie had some great points. And I think Con Edison is trying to do some of the same things. I think something that came to my attention when I was doing a project on looking at equity in the clean energy transition. One of the things that we've been talking about, right, EJ, environmental justice, and how we can do better in that space, right, was identifying that we had some folks at Con Ed working in supply diversity, but then beyond that one little space, that one little pocket, expanded to our EE program, and then worked with the community to train folks to do energy efficiency audits and work with us, which was just something that we hadn't done previously, and then trying to expand that program to do that more with some of the suppliers and the businesses that we do business with. And I think that's a great example of trying to involve the community in this clean energy transition and how we can do better in this DE&I space. I think we have a ways to go. There's lots more that we can do, but it takes things like this and conversations like this to expand that to what more can we do, right? Because we're doing an okay job, but we could do better. So how can we do better? And I think conversations like this, and I think there's a question we got from the audience that we'll probably kind of try to weave in, but a great question. How do we collect all of these collective lessons learned and findings and share them so that others can learn from the things that we are learning and experiencing and trying to change? So definitely open dialogue that we should continue to have.
Absolutely. And we are certainly coming to that question from our audience member. I just wanted to double back with Tohma and see if there was anything more that you wanted to add. But before that, Tohma, Gina, what I wanted to add, and I think for many, the conversation or even the terminology around environmental justice, right? You start to think about the language and the conversations that are shifting, which many of us probably early in our careers were not a conversation, right? And so there's something to be said there on how do you not just advance it, but how do we make sure that it doesn't fade away? So Tohma, before we move to our next question, just wanted to check and see if there were any other ideas you had on how corporate America can contribute outside of the walls of their employers.
Absolutely. I think that corporate America has to engage communities outside of times of crisis. So it shouldn't just be a storm. It shouldn't just be a weather-related event, a gas event. Engage the communities, stay committed within the communities, doing very positive things, even beyond our philanthropic efforts that we have right now, because corporate America has its own superpower. Not being afraid to get into the space of social and justice to ensure like that people that work for you and your customers have rights, access, and participation is extremely critical. There was a polling that I looked at, and it said roughly 75 to 85% of Americans strongly believe that companies should be taking concrete steps to create a more equitable future going forward. And in 2020, I looked at a lot of data, and consumers were watching. And it's not necessarily as important for utility companies, but consumers overall were watching, and 86% expected companies to speak out against social injustice. And 35% of employees reconsidered their commitments to their employers because they didn't feel like their employers were doing enough. So if you want a more equitable future, you have to leverage some of your relationships to advance some of this DE&I work. And you can do that by lobbying support. We have lobbyists for everything else. To put some of that support for issues that increase access for people of color. Send letters to Congress opposing bills that will reduce participation for people of color. Co-write and sign op-eds. Do social media campaigns. There are things that we can do within our confines and we don't have to, it's not such a heavy lift, but it will show your employees that you're committed to this space, and enhance these relationships and build pipelines so that minorities and people of color are not left out of the clean energy conversation going forward. If you know that that is the industry of the future, or this is what we're focusing on, we need pipelines to ensure that we are tapping into these minority serving institutions and these HBCUs or wherever else minorities attend colleges to receive that type of talent. We don't want to wait till we get there to say, we couldn't find anybody. There is no one. We could create that pipeline and create like ecosystems. There's a group in the fellowship that's creating an ecosystem to support women and minority businesses to ensure that there's equity when you're competing for these bids against larger companies, help with mentoring them and sponsoring them and helping them because they don't have the same type of bandwidth. So there are a lot of things that companies, corporations can do outside of the walls.
And I see Gina had a thought. Tohma, thank you so much for that. And it will connect. Go ahead, Gina. I'll let you jump in.
Just one point to piggyback the pipeline. I think some things that we do, and I think others should also consider if they don't already, is we're saying college or maybe technical high schools. I say let's start in schools. So we get children interested in the energy industry, and that kind of just gives us, it starts to develop that pipeline. So even considering starting even earlier, while you might not see the short-term benefits, definitely will have the long-term benefits.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm going to put a pin just for 1 second into the conversation around attraction and retention because we're coming there next. But I don't want to forget this question from one of our audience members. And each of you have shared some really great insights and some best practices and things that companies are doing. Does anyone know if there is a centrally available kind of repository on best practices, anything that's been published in this space? And if one doesn't exist, is there an opportunity to create that? Is that something that we can create? Natalie, I know you're talking about what National Grid is doing in this 2022 initiative, but anyone know of a central repository on best practices? We benchmark so much with each other. Would love to share if anyone has used one, knows of one, or is that a gap that we need to put our superpowers together to figure out how do we create it? And I'll open that to any of the panelists. Natalie, you want to start?
Yeah, I think even if there was a resource like that, the fact that it's not well known is itself an opportunity, right? Because there can be great resources out there, and if none of us know about it, well then, right? So I just wanted to make that point that I'm unaware of. I'm sure, I mean, for example, there are things like CEO Action for Inclusion, as Tohma mentioned before. There are larger industry best practices. You can go on any business publication these days, Harvard Business Review, Business Insider, any of those, and type in DEI, multiple things will come up, which I think is great. That wasn't always the case, right? But to your point, even as the DEI conversation is louder than ever before, does that mean there are resources available in a place that's easily accessible, easily updated, and easily drawn from? I'm not sure. And maybe the fact that I'm not sure tells you that there's an opportunity.
Absolutely. Anyone else aware of, used anything? Like I would agree, there's lots of research. Tohma, in the CEO for Action, are you guys putting out anything? Is there anything that comes from that space when you're leveraging across industries?
There isn't anything specific to the utility industry within CEO Action for Racial Equity, but I think that the question gives me some ideas on how we, if there was a utility playbook on DE&I that we came together as companies to put together. I think that's an awesome question, and it just makes me think a little bit more about what we possibly can do to share some of this within our industry.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. And hopefully that answers the question from our audience panel. And certainly I think you've gotten the wheels spinning amongst our panelists, which I would say with the experience and the power of this panel is certainly a good place to drop that gem and that opportunity. So I'm going to shift us back to the conversation around talent attraction and retention, kind of looking at it in both ways. And Gina, you started the head nod where you started with how early do we start, right? We talk about STEM programs and minority students, and what are we doing around attracting and retaining talent. So I'm going to start first with, I would say retention is probably one of the challenges that we have when you talk about diversity in our industry. So how are your individual companies seeking to retain the diversity it attracts? We often say there's a lot of work that we put in front to recruit a pipeline, to build a pipeline, to bring employees into our company at all levels, right? It's to the point that you made, Natalie, it's at all levels of a leadership in an organization. But recruiting is just the first phase. It's the retention piece that is there. So I'm going to start that question with Nancy around what is your company doing to seek to retain the diversity that it's attracting? And if you want to start with what you do to first attract it, but really want to spend some time on the retention efforts.
So thank you, LaAsia. And can I say this conversation has been really, really good and motivating for me even. And to the question, lots of times as experts, we rely on each other and we connect with each other around best practices and things that might work for our particular companies. Retention is very important, right? You're trying to attract diverse talent and you really need to figure out what happens when you come through that door. We're putting out all the, we have our ERGs, we have our 10 commitments, we have our reputation is out there, we're aligning ourselves with external partners and all of this. But when you walk through the door day one, what do you experience? And for us as people of color, we're one-off, right? You may find a second person in your particular group. Your business unit is not going to be fully diverse. And if it is, congratulations, but that's not the rule across the organization. So what we've done is focused on a number of areas. One thing that comes up a lot is expanding or filling the gaps or helping our management team or people managers to lead in a more inclusive way. And that means understanding bias, being able to identify when it's showing up, identify the microaggressions that are problematic, and taking action. The other thing is just understanding that all of us have bias. So we had a mitigating bias series. One was around performance evaluations and not relying on your personal emotional feeling of what happened recently and seeking diverse perspectives. And you would believe that in performance evaluations, people are doing that normally, not really, right? So we had that. And then we actually did another training on mitigating bias in everyday decisions with regard to your team and with regard to business units. So that's one area. And then we've worked with our talent development folks, right? So we've tried to really work to add DE&I competencies and components to the management plan, the management training programs that we have. And I really feel like that will help as we try to professionally develop our teams. Another thing that we did is worked on the commitment to professionally developing our employees of color. So we just launched last year a targeted program. It was the first targeted professional development program that we had, a 6-month program that included a mentoring component with senior staff, as in EMC level staff, not even middle managers. And put that together, invited our employees of color to participate. It's a small cohort right now at 18, and we're halfway through there, and we're getting a lot of good feedback around talking about things that we experience as people of color coming into the workplace and how to navigate that space and not become disengaged. Because, it's very easy to just give up. And it winds up stifling our opportunity as well. And then another thing, it goes on, but we have things like MBA programs that people can apply to. And then there's the developmental training. And what we're doing is focusing on how many people are represented in these programs, because we never really used to pay attention through that lens before. So if it's the succession planning, if it's getting into some of these programs. And I should say the Pathways program was the first one that you just applied to. It didn't require any supervisors to, recommend and refer onwards, because they tend to send the same people. This one, you just applied, and you didn't require the managers putting leverage on the process. So there was no pressure on there. And we tackled that challenge, or that barrier sometimes, to people getting into these programs. So I think those things, and encouraging our executive sponsors to participate in our employee resource groups. We have 6, and they each have executive sponsors, and we've tried to make clear and work with them on that program, so that they understand it's not just sitting there and listening to employees. It's also personally working with them and looking at their developmental plans, and trying to mentor folks downward as well as receive upward, but really put some actions into being an executive sponsor, so you're not just performative. And I think some of those things will help our employees of color to come into the workspace and feel like they're really included. And there's a chance that they will have an equitable opportunity, if you put your hand up, to be promoted, or even career development. Things like career pathing. It's a very huge undertaking of our HR team, and we're in like phase 3 of making it transparent, because so many people, one person, I come in and work for one manager, and I'm like, on my way, she's so great, I have opportunities, and the next person beside you will tell you, I was told I need a degree, I need to get PMP certification, I need to get all these things before I can progress, and then I got it and nothing happened. So we're trying to put together career pathing, so everybody knows what are the ways you can advance in our company, and that you're not pigeonholed to just one particular group or one particular business practice. And I think,
thank you, Nancy.
that should help folks.
Yeah, I was taking notes with some of what you were sharing, and you started off with maybe training and educating, and maybe re-educating when you have that conversation around conscious and unconscious biases, right? And people leaders, and the role that people leaders play in retaining talent. So thank you for sharing much of what NYPA's. I'm sure there's more to it, but thank you for those tidbits as well. So I'm going to switch over to Natalie now and hear her insights with regards to what her company is doing in terms of retaining talent.
Yeah, I mean, if you'll oblige me, LaAsia, I have a couple of small stories for you. And I'll just call out the first one, because I feel like I need it. Shortly after I joined National Grid, National Grid's been involved in AABE for a long time, and I believe it was the conference, and I joined where we do the networking. And I was in a breakout room with another exec from another utility, and we were waiting for people to come into our room to kick off, and we introduced ourselves to one another. I think I was fresh into National Grid. I don't think the ink had dried, really. And the first thing this man said to me was, "Nice to meet you. What's going on at National Grid?" And I'm like, what do you mean? And he says, "Everybody's talking about how you can't retain senior Black talent." And when I tell you, I was so embarrassed, because what am I supposed to say, right? And it was something that I've said, and obviously keeping that person's name anonymous, it's a story I've told at our company, because people who make decisions, right, outside of myself, need to know that our reputation precedes us, right? And when we talk about retaining talent, right, we often think it's an internal thing, right? What are we going to do? Who's our talent? And we forget that in the industry at large, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, which we need to change, there's only so many of us. So the Black talent we've lost now work at other utilities, and vice versa, right? So when we think about, and this is what I mean when I say retention also drives attraction. We can have the best attraction on the planet, but again, if this is coming up backstage at an AABE conference, right, then when we go after someone and say we really want them to come work for us, they might be like, no, I've heard about Shaw. You know what I mean? And so, and also be clear on the other way around. Personally, I like seeing companies that have a lot of Black executives, That was important to me when I was fresh out of college, going to an internship program. That's important to me now as one of those Black executives, right? And so like attracts like. I don't, it makes me attracted to the company when I see myself, and be clear, not one, not two. I see myself. There are options of people who look like me. There are different personalities of people who look like me. There are different business units at the company. We all not in one business unit over here in the corner. I can do anything at the company, right? And so that's a subliminal message. So when we talk about attraction and retention, we often think about it as two different things, and we forget that they both interact and influence one another, right? And that's really important. Another thing I will say really quickly is that with attraction, we often think, as I mentioned, about early career. I think it's because, and this is across companies I've worked at, I don't know if we just like that topic more. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel like we're investing in the next generation. And I do agree that we need to be in schools and colleges. But one thing I say often here, as at other companies, is we have to be just as energized about making sure our executive search partners care as much about diversity as we do with what colleges we go to. Because we all know we can have the most diverse internship program on the planet this year, and it will be 30 years before any one of those people are at the place where they're making company-wide decisions, right? And that's if they stay for 30 years and they don't leave, right? And so that's what I mean by attraction and retention, right? So it's really important that we are thinking about diversity at all levels of the organization. And a big thing you need to focus on is especially not just internal promotions and things like that, but also if your company engages in a lot of external hiring, that's a first stop of what is that? What are the results of that? What search partners are we using? Do they focus on DI? If they don't, then if we're not seeing the results, we need to have a conversation with them. Again, show me who you do business with and I'll tell you who you are, right? And that's important. And the last thing I will say is we have spent at National Grid about 6 to 8 months straight on a project that we started that we coined state interviews, which now is getting a lot of press due to the Great Resignation. A lot of people are using that term or having similar projects, but we were doing this starting 2 years ago. And then we really brought the heat up again and did like a company-wide state interview project by the DEI team. And we asked everyone who's just starting with our leadership population, directors and above globally at National Grid, we offered, if you want to do a state interview, we'll do one. And we had over 200 leaders, actually equally distributed between the UK and the US, which is also interesting, right? Volunteer to be interviewed. And we asked them core, 10 questions, what attracted you to the company? Has it met your expectations? What would make you stay? What would make you leave? Do you feel included? Do you feel supported by leadership? Questions like that. And we literally logged their answers. And we would confirm with them, okay, from what I heard from your answer, here are the top 3 things. Would you agree? So we were really calculated and statistically minded with this. And we aggregated the data and how the project was included. And I just literally presented the findings to our leadership team as well as our board. And I'll close with this story. Before I presented it to the board, I opened my presentation with a story about a woman a lot of us respect and know, right, in this room, Shonda Rhimes. If you don't know the story about Shonda Rhimes, I highly encourage you to look it up with ABC. And 30-second version of the story, Shonda Rhimes, as we know, Grey's Anatomy, Scandal, they had a whole weeknight, Thursday night on ABC dedicated to her work. She has made millions and millions of dollars for ABC. Disney owns ABC, and senior executives, as the story goes, get Disney tickets once a quarter, once a year to go with their families. Shonda Rhimes was having family visit for the weekend, and she reused the passes she got, and so she asked for a couple more. She calls an executive at ABC, another senior exec who could grant that request, at which allegedly this person said, "Don't we already give you enough?" Right? This is Shonda Rhimes, okay? And Shonda Rhimes hung up the phone, finished the conversation, hung up the phone, and immediately, again, as the story goes, and this has been reported, again, none of us were there except for her, so I'm not saying like I was there, but she picked up the phone and calls her lawyer and says, "Call Netflix." Okay? Within a blink of an eye, Shonda Rhimes had left ABC, signed a deal with Netflix, and I think within a year or so, dropped Bridgerton, which in the pandemic has set every record until I think Squid Games came along for profitability, views. I mean, it literally made hundreds of millions of dollars just in our country and across the world, right? So adding it up is probably billions of dollars of revenue. And I opened my presentation to the board about the stay interview findings with that story. And coincidentally, Shonda Rhimes was on the cover of Time magazine that week and that month. And I brought it and showed them, look, here she is. And I made the point to get their attention. And none of them had heard the story actually before, but I made the point with retention, it's often not the big things, it's the small things, right? That Disney pass is worth about $120, right? And which one do we want as an organization? And I'll pose it to this room as well. Which one do we want as an industry? Which one do we care about more? The $120 or the billions that someone else can get because we didn't take care of our people, right? And so when I'm backstage at AABE and someone says that to me, it tells me what we cared about more in the past. We cared about the Disney pass instead of our people. And so I think that's something that's on my mind often. And when we talk about attraction, we talk about colleges, yes, well and good. But let's think about changing our mindset about the Disney pass. And I would encourage everyone here, as well as everyone listening, if you are interviewing for a role, if you are thinking of joining a utility or any company, I encourage you to keep that in mind and to join an organization. None of us are perfect, right? But if they can show you how much work they're doing to turn it around, be mindful of that. And you want to be a part of an organization that's willing to do that work. So really long answer. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, but I hope it was helpful because this is a really important topic that I think not a lot of us talk enough about, because in many ways, I think it's easier to talk about who we need to hire instead of talking about changing the way we work. So that way, when we hire them, they're not gone in 6 months.
Absolutely. And a great story. And I think many of us heard the Shonda Rhimes story, but I like what you said. It's not the big things. It's often the small things or the cumulative small things that will lead, right? It's small, it's a little small, then you start to feel a little bigger. And there's something that I took from that story, even as you were sharing it for us personally, is knowing our value and the worth that we bring into the spaces and places that we occupy. So I'm going to just go to Gina really quickly with regards to the same question around what we're doing, what your company is doing with regards to retention.
So thanks for that, and great story, Natalie. I had bits and pieces of it, but hearing it, the whole shebang was very interesting to hear. I think it's something that we're working on, like other companies. I think that to Natalie's point about starting small and the connection between attraction and retention, I think you start really early. It's the attraction, the onboarding. Mm-hmm. The things you do at the beginning and the foundation of the relationship, like having a buddy system, establishing mentors, understanding who the points of contact are for XYZ is important to set the foundation for that retention. And I've been here 21 years, going on 22. Clearly something's going pretty okay that I'm still like, yeah, Con Ed, right? But there's more we could do. Right. So I think it's a conversation that we're also continuing to have. But I do think it starts really early and you have to just continue. And it's like the follow through, right? You just can't bring them in and then drop them off. It's like you bring them in and you check in, right? And you have continuous kind of continue the conversation.
Thank you for that, Gina. Tohma, anything that you want to add before I move on to our next question?
I was just going to sneak it in if you didn't call on me, but like by addressing like societal issues, there is an opportunity to improve your talent acquisition and employee retention, especially important for companies who are facing these mass retention flights since 2020. So I believe that people are less tolerant of working for companies that they believe that they don't care about their overall well-being. And it was very disappointing to me. I'll just share it was very disappointing to me being in a meeting the day after the murder of George Floyd, and everyone in that meeting talked about how nice the weather was the weekend before. And no one acknowledged my humanity, how I was feeling, what happened to Mr. Floyd. It was so public. I'm sure everybody saw it, but no one mentioned it. And I'm so grateful that our CEO at the time, John McAvoy, did. He sent out something about it. And then mostly everyone followed suit afterwards. But it's very important for us to pay attention to culture and changing mindset and changing culture. And that's not easy. It's not easy. That's the only thing I wanted to add.
Thank you so much for that, Tohma. And thank you for sharing that personal message, right? Because it goes back to, am I seen, am I heard, do I matter, right? Is it important? And Natalie, and I'm gonna wrap with this one question. I'm gonna ask the question and then lead into with something, because you mentioned the Great Resignation, and I don't wanna assume that everyone in the audience is in this space and kind of understands what's happening in the talent management, attraction, retention world. But while I give some information, the question I'm gonna ask you all is, for anyone that is looking at an employer, looking to start their career, maybe looking to change careers in our industry, and you're identifying, is this company right for me? What is one question that you would think that they can ask of their future employer or current employer to ensure or confirm that that employer has a continued commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? So one question is what I'm going to ask, because it may be the question that someone's going on an interview with. It may be a question where someone's thinking about, how do I assess my employer? And I think it would be great for this panel to share that one question. And I think it's very timely, because you talked about the Great Resignation, right? And organizations we know are really facing the biggest talent crisis since about 2008, is what many of the articles and surveys say, where people aren't competing for jobs. To be quite honest, companies are competing for people. Mm-hmm. So to own that we are in the driver's seat when we're making decisions. And there was a Microsoft survey that I had read where it said something like 40% of the global workforce is considering resigning from their current roles and considering a job change. So it's real. We're being authentic in this conversation around what does it look like for our industry. And I think it's a real moment for companies to recognize that current employees and new employees are assessing us through that lens. So if you were going into a job or going into a conversation with a current manager, what would be the one question that you would ask to make sure or confirm that your employer has a continued commitment to DE&I? So I'm going to start that question with Natalie.
Man, it's kind of funny, because I in 2021, I guess, I went viral on Instagram due to my funny content on interview questions. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart. One thing I want people to know is that, and this leads to my question that I'm going to share, is that when you're interviewing for a job and when you are asking these questions, it's really important, I believe, the interview is where values are shown, right? And of an organization, and also your own values. And don't be afraid to ask the question that kind of pokes behind the messaging or the statement, right? And and also a big myth in companies that many a recruiter will tell you, or many of a hiring manager will tell you, is, oh, the company's doing this. Or this is my personal favorite, oh, we have a chief diversity officer, her name is Natalie Edwards, right? And she's new and she's doing great work. You know what I mean? And I do believe there's good intent behind that. Like, people really, when they get questions about diversity, they will talk about the company, right? And so one of the things that I encourage you all to ask, because the reality is, yes, you work for the company, but the reality of your experience is going to be working for a person, right? And it's not me. Okay, I hired people on my own team, right? So at the end of the day, the question I would ask or encourage you to ask is something along the lines of, I see diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to the national grid, or insert company name here. And I know that DEI is successful when it is owned by every leader at the organization. It's important for me to work on an inclusive team. How have you gotten involved with the company's DEI efforts? What have you learned? Can you share about your experience as the company has increased its focus, what that has meant for you? And if they look like they're about to have a heart attack, take note, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. I wrote that question down. I'm sure many of us have. This is the line between moderator and audience member. But really great question. It's the personal commitment.
Yes,
and it's not
it's
what the
important
company is
too,
doing.
because, and be clear, the questions you ask somebody educates them as well on what, to your point, LaAsia, companies are competing for people nowadays. And if hiring managers are being asked questions like that, it puts them on notice that this is what the future talent is looking for. And I need to get with the program, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's really important you ask those questions and help them be educated as well, even if you don't get the answer you were looking for. It's important for both parties.
Absolutely. Thank you, Natalie. Nancy, I'm going to go to you with what one question would you ask?
I think, Natalie, that's brilliant, and that's exactly right, because talk is cheap, right? And we want to know about behaviors, right? I think when you're interviewing, remember, you're interviewing the company. You're trying to figure out, is this a right fit for you? As much as you're trying to say, hey, I have the answer, you need me, you also want to make sure 100% that you're going into a space that you feel confident that you will be able to function as your authentic self. I think in this climate, one of the things to ask is what's changed, right? Companies probably did, all the good sounds, made all the good sounds and made all the good intentions public. Ask what's changed. Have you, what tangible things have you done that is supposed to improve the experience, my experience, as I walk through the door? I think that's something you should ask.
Powerful question, Natalie, and excuse me, Nancy, and I appreciate what you said.
So I get it.
It's two ends, and you're right, but my apologies. I would say a powerful question in the sense that I like the tangible piece. Don't just give me the fluff. Give me the what can I see? What has changed beyond the narrative? What has tangibly changed? That is another question that I'm sure we are all writing down. I wrote it down as well, so thank you for that. And putting it in some context, right? Before and now, because we're having this kind of a panel conversation because we know that in 2020 and since 2020, many companies have stepped up their commitment. So here's the time to ask of that tangible change. Thank you so much for that, Nancy. Next, I'm going to go to Tohma with the same question. What one question would you ask?
Oh, goodness. I would say, so by addressing racial disparities, it is said that the GDP over the next 5-year span, that's the gross domestic product, will increase by $5 trillion. That's only if we address the racial disparities. So one of the things that I may ask is about the return on investment and how the company is tying in their leadership compensation to DE&I goals, and what does that look like? If the interviewer could explain to me specifically what the leaders are expected to do, if they are expected to grow their workforce by this percent by this date, I would want to know if some of the goals are specific and tangible. So that is one of the things that I would put out there and ask, because everybody cares about the GDP and capital, and how are we then making sure compensation is tied to that?
That's another great question. I have a running list here. And Nancy, that actually ties to your question, right? Tangible, what things have happened. So if you're in that interview and you ask the question, and to tie it back to Natalie, and the person you ask gives you that surprise look, and you ask Nancy's question, you can say, for example, has your company done anything to tie, right? You turn into the interviewer. You make it known what it is that you're looking for. So I love how this is weaving together. And Gina, I'm going to close out with you. What question would you ask or suggest be asked?
Yeah, great questions from the other panel members. I was going to say, and I was thinking about this, what have you done to educate yourself in this space? right? There's a ton of resources out there. What have you personally, right, to take it back to the individual versus the company, what have you done, right? And if they don't, you can name a few books, you can name a few podcasts, and there's a lot of resources, and I hope they're doing their homework.
Another really good one. And I think to tie to the theme, it's a lot of, we don't want to hear the 30,000 foot answer. We want to hear the tangible, experiential, making a difference in the experience as an employee to a company with regards to DE&I. So that was our last question. Gina, Tohma, Nancy, and Natalie, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, for sharing all that you are doing, that your companies are doing in this space, and the fact that we are on a journey. When we registered for this session, it kind of opened with the idea that all of our companies since 2020, and likely before, right, but in 2020 certainly pushed us to elevate our commitment to improving diversity, equity, and inclusion within our ranks, and especially within our leadership ranks. And we all know the value of diversity. This really transparent and authentic conversation was to help us to understand what our companies can be doing, should be doing, the questions we should be asking. So thank you all so much for giving of your time and giving of your knowledge and experience. I am sure that the members of the audience, and myself included, got a lot of gems from each of you. So we thank you for the work that you're doing, that you continue to do, and for sharing your voice with us this afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us. We hope that you walked away with some great information. And if there are questions that you think of or things that you didn't put into the chat, if there are other things that come up, I am sure that this dynamic panel will be more than willing to answer on the side. So thank you again. Have a great day. Be safe. And thank you to AABE for such an amazing panel experience.